Hey, I'm Lana from Lana Glowshot Art, and in this video, we'll be unboxing the December 2023 Sketchbox. This is a true mixed media box, and in this video, we'll be exploring how to render volume and a variety of colored pencil techniques. Ready? Let's go. The surface in this month's box is the Rembrandt watercolor paper. This is a rough, heavyweight watercolor paper that's 140 pounds. And there are 10 4x6 sheets in the poly bag. Look at how thick and durable they are. We also have 3 polychromos colored pencils by Faber-Castel. These are an extremely high quality colored pencil and are one of the professional grade colored pencils that I use in my personal work. We have juniper green, indanthrene blue, and magenta in this set. Let's start by swatching the magenta. When you work with colored pencils, you want to work with several light layers rather than pressing really hard right from the beginning. You'll notice right away that the texture of this surface doesn't allow you to get into all the nooks and crannies very easily. You're going to get a very textured coverage. But if you would like to get into all of those little gaps, I recommend working with an incredibly sharp colored pencil. I like the Faber-Castel colored pencil sharpener from the February 2023 box. This is a great way to get a razor sharp colored pencil that will be able to get into all of the grooves of this really rough watercolor paper. With your sharp pencil, come in with more pressure and work the pigment into all of the little nooks and crannies. I'm sure you've used colored pencils at some point before, but have you ever used them on a rough watercolor paper? It's gonna change the way that the pencil moves around on the paper, so play around with a couple different marks and get used to this new sensation. A gradient is a great way to play around. Start with a lot of pressure on the left and ease it up as you move towards the right. I like to move my pencil in small circular movements, going in lots of different directions to keep my coverage and my mark consistent. Sometimes colored pencil gets a bad rap and people complain that it's too difficult to fix mistakes because colored pencil doesn't erase very easily. But the way to combat this is to start with really light pencil sketches and build them up slowly. Here I'm sketching in a cute little winter beanie and I'm working with really basic shapes first. I've got the fur on the bottom, the half circle for where the hat shape actually is, and a little pom-pom on top. And then I'm working up with light layers of colored pencil to build in the value. I have decided that there is a light source coming in from the top right, so I'm going to have the shadow focused on the left side of the beanie. I've also played around a little bit with the direction of my mark to give it kind of a knit texture, with some strokes going vertical and some strokes going horizontal, and then changing this up in a predictable fashion. Next up, I'm swatching the juniper green and the indanthrene blue. And I'm gonna show you how to use these 2 colored pencils to sketch a pine tree with snow on it. Draw a couple triangles stacked on top of each other, and then add some light blobbies that are organic in shape that will represent the snow. Once you're happy with your light sketch, you can go over the top with a little bit more pressure to make it darker so it's easier to see. Then you'll use the juniper green to add in the green of the tree. Work in light layers and eventually start pressing harder with the darker parts of your tree. And to make that snow look really three-dimensional, add a light layer of blue on the underside. You can also use blue to intensify the shadows a little bit more. Next up, we have a gouache paint pan from Stone Ground in blue spruce. This color is incredibly cohesive with our colored pencils that we've swatched so far. We also have the Sketchbox signature round brush in size number 6. This brush comes to a nice sharp point for detail work and is also great at laying down washes. I recommend that you wet your paint pan before you start using it so that you can get a milky texture with your paint. Then play around with a variety of marks, holding your brush up on its point and also laying it down on its side. When you're ready to start playing around with washes of color, add more water so that you have more water than paint, and this will allow you to have a really light value wash. Here I'm creating a gradient. So I started with my light wash, but now I'm adding more concentrated pigment over on the left and building up darker values. Then I am subtly shifting those values lighter and lighter until it matches the original light value that I laid down. Now we're going to render a sphere. Start by freehanding or tracing a circle that takes up the majority of your page. If you're uncomfortable with freehanding circles, you can use the ring ruler from last month's box. Next, we are going to add the core shadow, and that is a shadow on the far left side of the sphere. I've identified that the light is coming from the top right corner, and so the darkest part will be on the bottom left. With my sketch in place, I know where I'm going, so I can jump into the gouache. Notice that my marks are following the form of this sphere as I paint it in, rather than being perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal lines. That allows the shape to feel more three-dimensional. As I move to the edge of the bottom left, I am adding in some reflected light. So I added more water. It's actually a little lighter in the farthest left. Now, as I'm moving towards the top right, I'm adding more water as I move towards that light shape or the lightest part of my sphere. I'm adding more and more water each time, and I'm allowing the gouache to just move around on the paper a little bit. It's hard to keep it super controlled when you're using this much water, but we can refine all the details with a colored pencil after our gouache has dried. The last piece is that cast shadow, which is the darkest part of the sphere, and I want the most concentrated version of gouache possible for this. This blue spruce gouache only goes to about a 60% level value. That's from a 0, which is white, to a 100%, which is black. So I want to make it a little bit darker, and I'm going to use the Indanthrene blue to really push the darkness in my core shadow. I start with the darkest that I can possibly get, and then I lighten it up as I move towards the bottom left. Because the paper is so rough, it's actually creating a little bit of dust as the colored pencil gets broken down over the surface. And if you want to, you can use your finger to move this dust around and to transition your values more smoothly. I'm going to do the same thing on the top of the sphere as I move towards the light source. I'm moving in small oval or circular shapes, and I am making them progressively lighter as I move towards the lightest part of the sphere. We also have the Kuretake Zig acrylic liner in gold. This is a really fun marker to work with, and to activate it, all you need to do is shake it and then press the nib into a scratch piece of paper. Most of the paint markers that I've used have a tendency to really spit out paint sometimes, and this one is no exception. Play around with a variety of different lines and explore different marks that you can make with this gold acrylic liner. This product is a great way to add some really fun pizzazz and glamour to your drawings, and it is going to be often your last and final stage of the drawing. So make sure that you're comfortable using this, because you're not going to want to make mistakes when your drawing is almost finished. Last but certainly not least is the Marvi Yukita La Plume. This is an opaque white paint marker that is going to add those final highlights to your drawing. But because it's white, we can't swatch it on a clean piece of the watercolor paper. Instead, we need to tone a piece of paper with the blue spruce gouache first. Activate this paint pen the same way you did with the acrylic liner, with a vigorous shake and then pressing it into a scratch piece of paper. This paint pen works very similarly to the gold acrylic liner, but there are a couple key differences I want to point out to you. One was that I was able to build up more opaque whites if I allowed my white first layer to dry, and then I came in over the top with the La Plume again. I also found that this one had a little bit more ink coming out when I pressed the nib down, and that it was more sensitive than I thought it would be at first. So I played around with this one a lot so that I got comfortable with how hard I could press without letting paint explode onto my drawing. This La Plume paint pen is also really great for adding highlights onto three-dimensional rendered forms. And here I'm coming in with a rounded rectangular shape to add a highlight onto my sphere. Last month, we discussed radial symmetry, and here is another excellent opportunity to practice it again. You can divide your space into equal segments and create symmetrical patterns all the way around with your paint pens. This allows you to create a really fun, interesting snowflake. You could also use your knowledge of the sphere to design a snow globe, which is the prompt for this month. Now let's put all of these materials and everything that we've learned together to create a really cute winter scene. I'm sketching a snowman on a sled, and I'm going to include a pine tree with snow on it and a cute little beanie on top of this snowman's head. For this sketch, I started with basic shapes like circles and triangles, and I kept my pressure really light. Then when I knew where everything was going, I added more pressure and more detail. After the sketch was complete, I added a light wash of color over the entire surface with the blue spruce gouache. A big reason for starting with a wash of gouache is to have a unified toned surface that is going to allow me to add whites back on top. Here, I'm coming into the spheres that make up the snowman, and I've established a light source in the top right corner again. And I have laid out the core shadow so that I know how these forms are going to move from light to dark. I render each of these spheres individually, being really careful with the boundaries on where they touch the other one, because if wet paint touches another wet paint, they are going to bleed together. I'm also adding a light wash in the background that is going to darken up some of those areas because I want a darker value to contrast against the lighter value that will be on the face at the very end when I add in the white highlights. And now I'm using the colored pencil to add more dimension to the spheres and to push the value even darker. While I have that blue colored pencil, I am going to come into the pine tree and to add some dimension to the snow. I'm using really light layers here, and I'm refining my sketch as I go. If you made the small pine tree first, there's going to be a couple things that are different when you enlarge it. And the biggest one is going to be how big these areas of green are. Start with light layers and build them up slowly. And focus on keeping your brush marks going the direction that the pine needles would grow. You don't have to draw each individual pine needle by any means, but think of the way that the branches are sloping down and out away from the trunk. You also are going to want to find a couple areas that are darker to add some contrast and shadows. A good natural place for these to be would be right underneath the bottom of each triangle. And you can use a combination of the magenta and the indanthrene blue to really intensify and deepen and darken your greens. Keep in mind throughout the entire drawing that your light source is going to be in the top right corner. So when you render the hat in magenta and when you lay in color on the sled, you are going to want to keep the light part on the top right, and that left side of the sled will mostly be in shadow, so you can come in really dark here with a very sharp colored pencil. Before getting into any of the details, I want to know where my lights are. So I'm coming in with the Le Plume paint pen and I am adding in the highlights. For the snow, I'm keeping my brightest whites towards the top of each of those organic snow shapes. And for the snowman, I am having a bright white towards the right side, and then I am feathering my mark towards the left to have a gradient effect on the sphere to make it feel really round. At this point, I've got the basics down and I'm going to come in and refine and add details. I'm smoothing out the tree with a layer of gouache, and I'm also adding more depth in the shadows. Now I can come in with more layers of colored pencil and add more depth and color into all areas of my drawing. These materials work so great together, and I'm able to draw colored pencil on top of paint marker on top of colored pencil, and work back and forth until I really get the quality and the detail that I want. One of the last moves was to use the gold acrylic liner to add some pizzazz to the sled and to add some sparkles and snowflakes in the sky. And now this piece is complete. I hope you learned a ton about working with gouache and colored pencils in this video, and I can't wait to see what you create. So be sure to use the hashtag SketchboxDecember when you post your work online. For more unboxing videos and tutorials, you can head over to our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.